There's a preaching blog I like to read that I read earlier this week, and she wrote about Palm Sunday, and she said that the thing about Palm Sunday is it's one of those Sundays of the year where surely clergy should have the Sunday off because the story tells itself. And because it was a preaching blog, of course, she was saying, so whatever you preach, just let the story preach itself. And I think that's really great advice. I wish she hadn't said it really only applies to Sundays like Palm Sunday, because I think it applies every Sunday. Because surely the story should preach itself, right? This story's not, I don't use a story to make a point. I make the point of the story. Isn't that what we're supposed to do? Clearly some of you aren't familiar with that. I'm not either, actually. I've heard it. Anyway, the point is, it's a great story. It's a great story. In fact, if you look it up in the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible, even, that's the latest sort of the one that most academic institutions use. The heading on this story is Jesus' Triumphal Entry into Jerusalem. That's what it's called, Jesus' Triumphal Entry into Jerusalem. For thousands of years, we've had parades, and some places in the world, they still do this. They have a big parade. The whole community gets together. They wave palm branches. Somebody is Jesus on the donkey. They wave the palm branches, they cheer, and they sing. And I'm not entirely convinced that's what the story's about, is the thing. We've always said it's Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. We've always described it, even as a kid. I remember hearing this story as, oh, this is a great big, and I was a choir boy, right? So like I did all the weekday things. So we started on Palm Sunday with, yay, Jesus, and then by Good Friday, that's not what's happening. And I was always kind of confused by that. I mean, everybody loves Jesus. We just did that on Sunday. Everybody loves Jesus. Why are they wanting to kill him now? Well, see, that's the interesting thing about the story. Is this story, first of all, it's not just this one day, it's all week. And secondly, there are some things in this story that make it really kind of confusing, that lead us to believe that perhaps this was a moment of triumph for Jesus. This was a moment of celebration. And there are things in the story that say exactly the opposite. In fact, there are even some things in the story that kind of beg the question of maybe this whole thing wasn't really just set up. So let's let the story speak for itself. The story says that Jesus sent the disciples on ahead to get the donkey, or the colt, a foal of a donkey. And this is really interesting, because when we were talking about this earlier in the week in a Bible study, there was one person in the Bible study who was really quite concerned because they were really bothered by the idea of a full-grown adult male sitting on the foal of a donkey, on a colt. And they should be, because they're not very big and they can't hold an adult. Which is also, by the way, why one of the tellings of this story in one of the Gospels, they tell it as that they bring the donkey as well. And the way it's written, it kind of sounds a little bit like Jesus is riding both of them at the same time. But of course, the point is he's probably riding the one that he should be on, the full-grown one, and they're bringing the colt as well, because the prophecy says, right? Zechariah famously said that the king that will bring peace and restore Jerusalem to its glory will come humble and riding on a donkey. By the way, because actually, thank you for the anthem, because the end of that closing of the anthem that says riding from Olivet, that is a fairly significant part of this prophecy too, because there's also a prophecy that says that Jerusalem will fall to the king who comes to Jerusalem from Mount Olivet. So we got two prophecies going on here that might lead us to believe that there's something very much worth celebrating here. Which then begs the question of why the crowd was yelling, "Save us." So here's Jesus. He's sent guys ahead to get the colt or the donkey, whichever, because that's a prophecy. That sounds a little bit like Jesus set that up, doesn't it? I mean, this is a part of the story that I think is kind of confusing. Why did the person who wrote this story include that? The prophecy simply says that Jesus will come, or the king will come riding a donkey. why include the part about how Jesus acquires the donkey? I don't actually have an answer for that, so if anybody does, throw it out. I don't know, because to me it kind of sounds like, I think he set that up so that it would look like he's fulfilling the prophecy. In fact, since he's coming from all of that as well, it kind of looks like Jesus set this all up so that you people waiting in line to get into Jerusalem for Passover, we'll talk about that in a second, might see it that way. Does that matter? Again, I don't have an answer for that question. Let's leave it just hanging there for now. But it's something worth thinking about, isn't it? Because here's the thing about this story. Passover, the people were coming to Jerusalem for Passover because Passover is one of the big celebrations. It's a pilgrimage celebration, so people go to Jerusalem, to the temple. And the reason they do that is because Passover, the name of the festival is really quite literal as to what it's about. Passover celebrates the freedom from Egypt. It celebrates, maybe that's not the right word, but it celebrates the last of the plagues that convinced the Pharaoh to let the Hebrew slaves go. It's when the angel of death arrived and took the firstborn of every household. That was the 10th plague. And when the angel of death came everywhere. So the Hebrews were warned ahead of time that if they wanted the angel of death to pass over their house, they had to mark the doorframe with the blood of a lamb. And so the angel of death would then know to pass over that house. So literally, Passover. But the point of Passover is, and why it's a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, is that it celebrates the freedom of the Hebrews from slavery. And here you are, coming to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover, and at the gate, the Roman soldiers are probably checking you for weapons, because the Romans control everything. You aren't free, and yet you are celebrating a festival of freedom. The Romans, it's entirely possible, by the way, that you were lined up at that gate to get in because there were Roman guards there, and they were likely checking you for weapons because any time there was an opportunity for people to gather together, of course, that was an opportunity for rebels or for zealots to come in and encourage people to rebel. Happened lots, which is why there was a garrison in Jerusalem. But the garrison in Jerusalem wasn't very big. So whenever there was a major festival, this is why later in the week we'll discover that Pilate was actually in town. He normally wouldn't be, but the Roman governor would arrive. So picture this. You're at the gate on the east side of Jerusalem. Mount Olivet's over there somewhere. You get the right way? Is that right? Is that east? Okay, Mount Olivet's over there. You're Jesus, you're coming into Jerusalem. You're waiting in line there, and you see Jesus coming on a donkey. And on the same day, on the other side of Jerusalem, on the west end of Jerusalem, Pilate is riding in on a horse, probably an armored horse, a war horse, at the head of a column of Roman soldiers to reinforce the garrison that's already in Jerusalem, just in case anything happens. Do you think that's why Jesus set that up that way? The whole thing with the donkey and the coming from all of it? Think of the contrast there. Here's the king that will save everyone, comes humble and riding on a donkey. A sign of peace, by the way. And from the other end of town, there's Pilate, the oppressor, with all his soldiers coming into town for the same event. So you're there. You've probably even picked the east gate because you knew that the Romans would be coming from the west, because Pilate was also the governor of 2 other states as well as Judea, and he would have been coming probably from one of those. So you probably even picked that gate on the east side so that you could avoid that. And here comes Jesus. You've heard of Jesus. He does really cool stuff. He heals people. He talks about how we should love each other. And people have been suggesting, you've heard this rumor, that maybe he's the Messiah. And then you see him on the donkey fulfilling the prophecy, coming from Olivet fulfilling the prophecy. Are you going to be super thrilled? Of course you are. Of course you are. And yes, you're going to cheer for Jesus. Of course you are. But you're also, because he's the Messiah, the one who will save you, you're also going to cry out for him to save you. That's the story that we hear today. Jesus comes into Jerusalem. It wasn't really a parade so much as something just sort of started. People started waving branches. There were palms handy. That's why we use palms. But, if it'd been today, we would have had dried, dead twigs probably or something. Because, even though it's spring, look at it out there. We had to shovel before we could put our coats down, But we would have done that because, hey, it's Jesus. Look, he's fulfilling the prophecy. He's the king that was promised. Kings should have a carpet to walk on. Let's put our coats down. One of the kids even said they had a red coat when we were telling the story earlier. And you wave your branches, yay, Jesus. Save us, Jesus. The king that will save us, the Messiah, has come. We're going to be saved. And Jesus comes into town, and then the parade's over. Yay, Palm Sunday's done. So we can skip right to next Sunday, right? Because that's what we often do. We just skip over the week, and we go from yay, Jesus on Palm Sunday to yay, Jesus on Easter Day. But we got to get there. And that's the thing about the Palm Sunday story. Is the Palm Sunday story isn't the end of the journey, it's the setup for the journey. And the journey includes, depending on which gospel story you read it from, the journey includes that famous scene where Jesus goes into the temple and he throws out the money changers and he throws their tables over. We talked about it a couple of weeks ago because John's gospel puts that story in a different place. But then Jesus teaches and he tells stories and he talks to people. And of course, as the week progresses, the Pharisees and the leaders in the temple are more and more and more and more annoyed, as if they weren't already annoyed, and they have passed the point of no return. In fact, many people feel that the reason that the three of the four Gospels tell that story of Jesus in the temple happening on Monday and Holy Week, tomorrow, is that it's the last straw. He's got to go. As far as the authorities are concerned, let's say that differently. As far as the temple authorities are concerned, he's got to go. As far as Herod's concerned, he's got to go. The Romans don't really care yet, but as far as the others are concerned, he's got to go. But as the week wears on, of course, stuff happens. And on Maundy Thursday, we call it Maundy Thursday because it's the day of the Last Supper, the story that we tell where Jesus gets the disciples together for the Passover meal. And from that, we have the story that gives us the sacrament of communion. And then Jesus goes out into the garden with them. The disciples all famously fall asleep, and Jesus talks to God. And then Judas arrives with the Roman soldiers, or the temple soldiers, and arrest Jesus. They take him off to see Pilate. Then he goes to Herod. Then he goes back to Pilate. You'll have to come on Thursday and Friday and find out what happens. But the thing about Thursday, by the way, is that there's another piece to that story that we're going to do here on Thursday at 7 o'clock, if you'd like to come. And that is that we're not just going to recognize that that's part of the story in which Jesus gives us the Last Supper, the elements of communion. But the part of the story that John tells, where Jesus gets a towel and a bowl of water, and he washes the feet of the disciples. And it's a really important part of the story. And if you come on Thursday and you are willing, I will wash your feet. Because it's an important part of the story. The point of this story is that it reminds the disciples that Jesus is the servant of all. And believe it or not, that's the connection to today's reading from Isaiah. In the middle of the book of Isaiah, there are these 4 servant songs. And they are the songs, the descriptions of what the Messiah truly should be. The Messiah is the servant of all. And the one that we heard this morning is the one that most suits this week, because it's about how the servant, the Messiah, will suffer. Because Jesus does. You know he does. If you know the story at all of Good Friday, amongst all of that stuff, Jesus is both verbally and physically abused and then crucified. Is that it, though? See, I think a big part of the suffering of Jesus this week isn't that piece at all. It's the realization that as he comes into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, and people are cheering for Jesus because he's the Messiah and he will save them, Jesus knows that they will not understand by the end of the week what it means for him to save them. Because when I was a kid, this was the part that always confused me, is people are cheering, yay, Jesus, on Sunday, and by Friday they want him crucified. Why? Is it maybe because he didn't deliver? They cheered him on Sunday because they thought he was the Messiah. And maybe he was that, Messiah with it. Where's his army? How's he going to overthrow the Romans? How's this going to work? We want action now. What do you do when you elect a politician who doesn't deliver on their promises? We don't crucify them anymore. Nobody say that, please. But we do vote them out, don't we? That's your right as a citizen. If they don't deliver, you vote them out. Jesus didn't deliver, as far as they were concerned, because what they wanted was Jesus to overthrow the Romans, lead an army and overthrow the Romans, and restore the glory of Israel as they understood it was supposed to be. And Jesus had a completely different agenda, because Jesus wasn't about that. In many ways, this was just the seed. It wasn't the world change that they expected. It was just the seed from which that change was going to grow. So before we even get to next Sunday, there's a long road ahead. It covers a very short amount of ground, but it covers a lot of emotion. It covers a lot of understanding of what Jesus was really all about. Jesus wasn't about overthrowing the Romans in a dramatic battle. It wasn't about armies. It wasn't specifically just about the Romans. It was about transformation. It was about changing people. And transformation takes time. I promise you that next Sunday, because I promised them, I promise you next Sunday, I will have an apple tree from which I will take an apple that I can eat. Promise. You know as well as I do, that's going to happen in a very different way than it naturally should, because it takes years to grow a tree to produce apples. Jesus wasn't going to change anything overnight. In fact, even the people that most believed in him, that he most trusted to follow him, in the end didn't. You can bet they were all there with him on Palm Sunday cheering and everything. But even Peter didn't stay. So here's the thing about Palm Sunday. It is both of those things. It is a moment of celebration. I'm still not sure about the triumphal part. I think we can wait a week for that. But it's a moment of celebration. It's a moment of recognition of Jesus is, what did I say earlier? Jesus is a big deal. But clearly, not in the way that many of those people who were cheering him on thought. They thought things were going to be different right away, and they were not. And yet, they kind of were. Because things started to change. People started to change. That's transformation isn't instant. It takes time. So Jesus arrives on this day and people are celebrating and cheering, and then over the week we have a story that unfolds that, well, all journeys have to end. And on Friday, it certainly appears to everyone that the journey has ended. Where are all of the disciples on Sunday morning? Next week, they're all hiding. Except for one, and we're going to talk about that later. But they're all in hiding. They're afraid because it's over. That piece of the journey, it may have come to an end, but for the new life to begin, it needs to. That's the story of this week. If you feel like joining us on Thursday night here at 7 o'clock, that's great. And Friday, of course, we've got the Walk of the Cross here in Ponoka. Bashaw has a Friday morning service at 10 o'clock to help tell the story this week. If you don't attend those, please read the story. Read through the story. It's in all four of the Gospels. Each of them has their own take on it. But read through the story, because we cannot arrive at the new beginning, which is next Sunday, without recognizing how this journey ends.